Hello, everybody. Welcome to the AIA New Jersey presentation on school and daycare design in a post-pandemic world. My name is Stacey Ruhle Kliesch. I'm a past president of AIA New Jersey, and I will be moderating today's program. We will be taking questions at the end of the three presentations, so please enter your questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to, ask any number of questions at any time, and we'll be consolidating and filtering through for any or all of the presenters. Let us begin. Today's course is registered with AIA National for one Health, Safety, Welfare Learning Unit. You will automatically be getting credit for this course by remaining with us on the course for the duration of the hour and completing the survey that you will receive tomorrow from AIA New Jersey. So you do not need to self-certify. And you should be seeing the credits pop up in your record within the next month. Things have been running a little bit slow as it's the end of the year, and a lot of organizations have been putting together programs. So things are a little bit slower processing from national. Today's course is School and Daycare Design in a Post-Pandemic World. During the current COVID-19 pandemic, the entire world has had to adapt to the massive impacts caused by the novel coronavirus. While essential buildings remained occupied, most schools and daycare centers were closed as the students and teachers pivoted to remote learning from home. For architects and designers working in the education sector, I would categorize our response is falling into two broad categories. The re-entry stage, which is actively underway, now involves immediate and short-term solutions to help clients create safer school building environments that help limit the spread of the coronavirus. The reimagination stage involves more forward-looking creative thinking about long-term design solutions for education and early learning buildings. Architects are uniquely qualified to synthesize the many evolving health, cultural, and market shifts resulting from the pandemic that may have a lasting impact on how school buildings are designed and used for decades to come. Clients have historically asked architects and engineers to deliver the most cost-effective building to build upfront due to budget constraints with less emphasis on operating costs or long-term maintenance concerns. This often means buildings that are just designed to meet bare minimum building codes unless a third-party volunteer certification program like LEED is being pursued. Post-pandemic, going beyond minimum code minimum in ventilation, energy performance, healthy materials, and spatial allocation may be considered. Our learning objectives today include health. Participants will understand how the novel coronavirus disease, COVID-19, is transmitted and what school childcare building planning, design, and operation mitigation strategies can be applied to existing education building components to allow for physical, emotional, and social well-being of the occupants with reduced transmission of pathogens. Safety. Participants will learn forward-looking creative design solutions that may shape the safety of future learning environments and school buildings to protect occupants, users, and others from pathogen transmission in the post-pandemic world. Welfare. Participants will be presented with varied touchless sanitizing and acoustic enhancing technologies that will allow for healthy in-facility learning that encourages safe social interaction. Welfare and sustainable design. Participants will learn options in LEED and WELL for addressing concerns in educational facility design while benefiting the environment. Our speakers today include Jason Kliwinski, a past president of AIA New Jersey, who specializes in green architecture, consulting, and education. Jason is a fellow in LEED and one of the founding members of USGBC in New Jersey. He owns his own firm called Designs for Life that specializes in sustainable design for corporate, commercial, institutional, educational, hospitality, and residential clients. He is a consultant for facilities that want to improve their sustainability or healthy standards using both LEED and WELL design integration into their existing building. And he's also an educator. He's a LEED faculty member, a climate reality leader, and G-Pro instructor, and has taught at many of the local universities in New York and New Jersey. He's also a national speaker and the founder of East Coast Green, which is in its 10-year anniversary as the largest East Coast environmental conference and a specialty program of AIA New Jersey. Thank you for joining us today, Jason. Our next speaker is Justin Mihalik. Justin is also a past president of AIA New Jersey. He owns his own firm and has been the principal for 22 years. He has offices located in Tampa, Florida, and New Jersey. Justin has been designing childcare centers for more than 10 years, and today he will be bringing his expertise in daycare and childcare centers to our program. Justin, welcome and thank you for joining us. Our third presenter will be Ron Weston. Ron is a past president of Newark and Suburban AIA chapter, and Ron is a senior director at PS&S. He has 35 years of professional experience as an architect and manager, leading in the design and planning of a diverse range of large scope projects regionally and nationally. He's an expert in public K-12 projects, and we are very excited to have him on our panel today to present to you current and future ideas for schools with regard to the pandemic. And myself, as I said, I'm a past president of AIA New Jersey. I own my own firm here in New Jersey, and I will be our moderator for the presentation today. We are bringing this presentation to you from the AIA New Jersey Public Awareness Committee. And while we welcome all of our members to be participants in today's call, we also are excited to welcome all of the non-members who have interest in school buildings and daycare centers to participate in today's call, and hope you will learn something from our members here at AIA New Jersey. The post-pandemic webinar series is something that was created by the Public Awareness Committee, and we are hosting this series for developers, business owners, facility managers, operators, realtors, and users to assist them in understanding facility design changes that can be anticipated in our post-pandemic world. Each of the webinars will focus on a different building, business type, and have a panel of experts who are expert in that, that sector. The full series is available for free to the general public as well as to our members, and we have one additional program coming up on December 17th on contract interiors. We are strategizing some additional sectors that we'll be covering in 2021, so do be on the lookout for additional programs in this webinar series. And that's it. I'll turn it over to Ron. Ron, you're on mute.
I'm also working on sharing my screen. So
okay.
Come up. All right. And we'll go to. All right. Good afternoon. And thank you, Stacey. I'm going to start with looking at the re-entry stage considerations with regard to COVID-19, what I like to call back to school, and facility strategies. When the pandemic started in March and April, architects who are working in the education space, like everywhere else, were forced to really do research and quickly come up to speed with best practices in how to advise our clients with regard to coronavirus. So the first way that anyone who's going to consider buildings and design with regard to responding and advising clients would be to understand the modes of COVID-19 transmission. And that starts with the three primary modes that I would identify. And most of us are familiar with having heard these just in the media, and frankly, it's because everybody's impacted by this. We know a little bit about it, but how do we apply that to buildings? So starting with person-to-person contact transmission, this is where we get our 6 foot of separation guidelines. And for architects and designers, really, to respond to the person-to-person transmission, we engage in looking at space planning and plan layouts, furnishing and FF&E, and signage, both wayfinding as well as instructional and informational signage, and can offer our clients that kind of guidance. The second mode, one that's gotten a lot of attention lately, is the airborne transmission or aerosol transmission. At the beginning of the pandemic, this was a concern, but it wasn't the most, it wasn't the priority concern as it has become recently. For this, architects working with our engineers need to consider ventilation, HVAC systems, and supplemental filtration systems for schools. And the last mode is surface transmission, fomites, i.e. the materials that can help spread the virus, or as we prefer, not spread the virus. And issues dealing with hygiene and cleaning. This was what came out first, if you recall. It was all the attention was not only on washing your hands, as it continues to be, but in those early days, it was the surfaces, the handles, all the other things. And so looking at materials and touchless controls and other things that designers can bring to the forefront with our clients. Now, once you understand the modes of transmission, then in school design, we need to then overlay that on the what are the common building components of both primary and secondary schools. And I break these down into 3 categories as well, starting with public spaces, from the entrance and the front door, which really is key to maintaining trust and also screening for health during the pandemic. Further into corridors, stairwells, a little bit lesser elevators, since most schools have control and limited use on their elevators, but nonetheless, those circulation spaces. And then of course, public restrooms, where hygiene is always a concern, and during the pandemic, it's paramount. The next category of spaces are the workhorses, if you will, of a school building, the instructional and assembly spaces, the classrooms, and those types of other support spaces where students and teachers spend the bulk of their time and lengthy periods of time together. And so how do we help schools and school districts to deal with the reduced occupancy, the spacing, things like that? And that's what architects and designers are focused on. And lastly, the amenity and support spaces, typically not as, well, they're important, they're common, et cetera, they have to be dealt with, but they're really in the supporting mode, except I would say the nurse's office and now quarantine spaces that have become an important topic during the pandemic. Now, one thing, there are a lot of guidelines out there. The AIA has some great publications, ASHRAE, the engineers, American Society of Heating and Refrigerating Engineers, of course, CDC and World Health Organization. There's a lot of resources out there. One thing that we did in our practice was to put together a series of checklists that we could share with clients to help them, give them guidance as they were trying to adapt and deal with that. This is just one visual of an example of that kind of checklist that we put together. And it deals with, just as I said earlier, overlaying solutions, typical solutions to the various types of spaces that are common in school buildings. Another thing we've done is look at what kind of architecture and engineering services can we provide. Obviously, architects who are working in the K-12 education sector are guiding and advising their clients to different degrees. That's been a combination for me of informal, just guidance, helping clients on a pro bono basis, and in a couple of cases, actually being commissioned to help them with their reentry plans. What you're looking at on screen here is working with one of our consultants in that health and safety area. We put together a 5-stage program that looked at how we could actually provide different stages of support, starting with assessment and planning, and then carrying through to implementation, communication, and monitoring. This also dealt with, if you look top down, the architectural, engineering, and health and safety components of each of those stages. To be honest, we never got beyond stage 1 and 2 on this. Assessment and planning have helped offer guidance and in some cases actually planning to schools and school districts that start with assessing what do they have, what are their facilities like, what are the opportunities and challenges they have, and then providing a planning overlay with regard to the building and grounds that is really only a small part of the overall reentry that each school has to deal with. Now, speaking of that reentry, the state of New Jersey Department of Education came out with this document, over 100 pages, the Road Back Restart and Recovery Plan for Education. It came out in the summer, and the school districts basically had until September to put together comprehensive plans. So in New Jersey here, we have, as you all know, over 500 school districts, in addition to charter schools and private schools. Each of them was kind of on their own to scramble in short order to put together a rather comprehensive plan with how they were going to get back in their schools. What I've highlighted here, this document has some good guidance. It has a lot of the usual things you would have heard coming out of CDC and other agencies, but it was very general. It didn't get into the specifics too deeply with regard to facilities. Jason's going to talk more about this when he gets to his segment. And so what I want to do is pivot now to what I call the reimagine post-pandemic stage. And this is really looking forward, right? We're all thankful that there are vaccines on the horizon, and hopefully less than a year from now, the worst of the pandemic is behind us. But what then? I want to start by mentioning that it's understood that what this pandemic has done across society and across many sectors is to accelerate trends that were already there. And in the case of education, it also has highlighted inequities that are there. Obviously, as students all moved to remote learning, that has been its challenge in its own right, because not all students had the equipment, had the wireless connectivity, or had the home environment that was conducive to education. So I just mentioned that because a lot of trends were already in place, and what happened all of a sudden around the entire world, and certainly for all of us, was this sudden exposure, if you will, to trends that were there. So one thing to think about post-pandemic is we have the hybrid learning and we have remote learning that have moved to the forefront. Frankly, it's a real challenge, and for working parents or any parents, getting their kids back in school is the priority. And after the pandemic has passed and the risk factors are gone, and we can get back to school in a more normal way, I still wonder, and we should all think about, how might some of the remote learning lessons maybe take hold? And maybe there's hybrid school models, both in the pedagogy, but also in the physical sense post-pandemic. Something to think about. Within school buildings, as I mentioned, the entry and security, this has been an issue in recent years because, unfortunately, of active shooter conditions and some of those mass shootings, which forced new standards, new requirements with regard to entrance security. Well, all of a sudden, the pandemic, health has become another component of risk and of security. So this is something also going forward. How might this carry forward with how we plan and design entrances to school and how we deal with a more, more expansive aspect of security? Within buildings, also the movement and flow, of course, is critical. It's something we talk about. But after the pandemic, the question is, the newer school buildings where you want open corridors. It's important during this pandemic to have social distancing and spacing. How much of that sticks kind of culturally, and how much of that consideration should we have in mind as we go forward? Being seen and seeing others at a distance is something within the physical environment that's important. And then also this notion of balancing the open public space versus closed, separate public spaces. So in any event, those are considerations that we have to balance that tension, if you will, between open and closed movement in schools. The durability and flexibility of furniture is another thing. There are already trends in education furniture that were taking hold. This again has really taken hold now during the pandemic, where classroom layouts have had to change. The occupancy is different. And so the question is, going forward, what are some of the trends from a design standpoint that we look at to create the ability for schools to quickly kind of rearrange and adjust dynamically their education spaces, and how does furniture and furnishing layouts play into that for architects and designers. We carry that forward and look at the entire idea of agility, if you will, and adaptable spaces. Maybe going forward, the school really is more of a network. Maybe there's opportunities for learning to happen in other places, in other spaces. And so that's for us designers to be leading that discussion and leading that thinking around that, as opposed to just moving back into the regular old schools and picking up where we left off to wait for the next event potentially to force a disruption. Alternative learning spaces is another opportunity here. Even prior to the pandemic, you were seeing trends where retail malls, let's say, some retail storefront office space that was no longer needed was being converted for various uses. In the healthcare sector, you've seen many outpatient health facilities move into these. Well, what about schools? The reality is it's far less expensive if you take underutilized real estate in offices and retail malls and brick and mortar retail space, and perhaps tied with a new approach to learning, some of these spaces can be adapted. You see a few images here, a couple on the left. Those are retail spaces that have been converted for extended learning programs. Well, maybe that's an opportunity post-pandemic as well that we need to be thinking about and promoting. Outdoor learning spaces is another opportunity here. There already are movements about green schoolyards, basically to really provide better space outside for recreation, for learning. During the pandemic, obviously, in climates and when the climate was warm enough, moving classrooms even outside, moving students outside more portions of the day, obviously is safer with regard to coronavirus. So the question is, how does this apply going forward? And then I extend that even further to say indoor-outdoor learning spaces. What are the opportunities there? Other countries are more on the forefront of looking at this kind of seamless interior and exterior consideration. And it's not only in warm tropical climates that don't have 4 seasons and winters. There are Nordic countries, frankly, where they're on the leading edge as well of this idea of indoor and outdoor spaces flowing together. As it's said in the saying goes, there is no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. Well, like I mentioned, in some of the Nordic countries, they're far out ahead on this idea of moving seamlessly between the inside and outside of buildings. And then, of course, another trend that was already in place is health and wellness with regard to schools. We know from some of the sustainability movements that the outcomes for students can be positively impacted by providing everything from lighting, quality lighting, better air, indoor air quality, things like that. And going forward, that now, to me, in addition to form and function, all of a sudden form, function, and health and wellness become part of a triumvirate of issues that architects and designers need to weigh equally. It's not purely about creating a pretty building. It's not purely about meeting the educational program. Now you're going to think even more broadly. And Jason's going to pick up on this theme more in his talk shortly. With that now, I'm going to hand off to Justin. So Justin, I'm going to stop sharing and unmute yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Ron. I apologize for that little interruption. Didn't realize that the camera would flip as I was adjusting it, but welcome everybody. Let me get into present mode here. Okay. So I work with about 5 of the major franchises, and they were all affected differently to some degree. Focusing here on New Jersey, of course, the pandemic in general, in New Jersey, of course, childcares were shut down. They were not considered to be an essential business. And because of that, the only way that they were able to stay open was if they had children that were of first responders. And even then, they were only allowed to have those children in the schools. And that really was only a handful of children. So you did have providers staying open during that time, even just for those handful of children. One of my clients ended up having to lay off more than 400 employees, all the teachers of those schools, center directors, because of the closing. And that was prior to PPP. Of course, when PPP was then issued, they were able to bring those employees back, even though they, number one, were not open, and then two, even upon reopening, the numbers of the children were very low. So some stats, as you'll see here on my slide, talk about how the children that in general, 86% of the child cares in the country opened with significantly fewer children. Let's see. I'm realizing that I guess everybody is seeing the notes too, so I wanted to Ron, just through this glitch here, how am I able to present so I could spare everybody of notes?
Click on slideshow at the top and then go all the way to the left and hit from the current slide.
Hey, Justin, right where you're at, if you click on display settings up top and then click swap presenter, there you go. There you go. You're good.
Thank you. So I think one of the major impacts here, and people have heard about this, is that it was estimated that at least 40% of child care centers would not reopen due to the financial impact from the pandemic. And I can't say that that's what I've seen. Again, my clients being the larger franchises, their centers, have reopened. So a large part of that 40% is really dealing with what we call mom and pop shops, which are the ones that they're smaller centers, but they're the ones that have been around for quite a long time serving communities. And again, unfortunately, it's a real shame. And I think the big issue from our learned lesson from this is the matter that child cares were not considered to be essential businesses. And it became very clear to the governor and the state that in order for the economic recovery to begin, they needed to get child care centers open. So on June 15th, child care centers were able to reopen, and there were guidelines that were issued that basically impacted how they had to screen, how they had to clean. Essentially, the occupancies of child care centers were cut in half. So now here these centers were going to reopen and essentially operating in the red. Restrictions on field trips or offsite activities, of course, PPP having to be in place, and actually teaching the children and reinforcing healthy hygiene practices. So ramping back up for the operators was not an easy task. Other than the fact that the cleaning and sanitation practices for child care centers are already mandated by the state, and in New Jersey, they're one of the tougher of states when it comes to that. So the ramping up part of doing more cleaning wasn't as much an issue as the center's now requiring to have more full-time teachers in place and or assistants in order to assist with the cleaning and the sanitation, because now it had to happen more frequently. Most childcare centers, they have a small part of their staff is actually full-time, and the larger part of the staff is actually part-time. So now there was an increase in overhead in order for them to really meet these standards. So as part of the regulations, and specifically on the screening methods, there were 2 approved methods. Method 1 involves the parents administering the screening and the staff strictly conducting a visual inspection of the child. Method 2 is where the staff administer the screening and requires them to do the screening behind a barrier such as plexiglass or even the car window, as well as using disposable gloves in addition to face masks. And then, of course, a whole cleaning process in that, and having to change gloves more frequently. So obviously the additional use of more PPP. Child cares in general, parents, and for those of you who have gone through this, it is not a drop off at the door like our elementary schools might be within your towns. You're actually parking your car and then walking into the school, signing your child in, and sometimes even then bringing your child to the classroom. As of today, parents are not allowed in the building, including visitors. So basically what happens is there's kind of two methods, where if the child care is doing sort of where they'll meet the parent out in the parking lot as a car pulls up, as I just explained, they would then do the inspection or the screening while the child's in the car, and then they would escort the child into the building. Otherwise, parents are walking up to the doors they normally would, but there's a table set up outside of even the vestibule where the parents then check in the child. And then there's also paperwork that has to get filled out, answering questions about whether or not the child is experiencing any signs of COVID. And at that point, again, the teacher and or center director is escorting the child into the building. Pickup time is just the reverse. The parents are coming to the door. The center director is actually seeing who the parent is, so they know then what child to bring out to them. But the director and or staff is going to the class, escorting the child from class to the exterior of the building. So now, of course, here we are in New Jersey with freezing temperatures starting, and now what's the answer to that? And so that's something that temporary enclosures to provide heat, and I'll get into that in the next slide, but now this is what's upon us. So the other requirement being reduced group sizes. So classrooms that have licensing of a maximum of 20 children now could only have 10 children, unless if you are now installing dividers so that your maximum group size was 10. With the fact that, again, upon reopening, the occupancy levels were very low, there really was no need to go and install these dividers. Today, the occupancy levels are up in the 50 to 75% level of where the original or pre-COVID. So just to give you an idea, most of the schools have occupancies of anywhere from 130 children to 200 children, again, with the larger franchises that I'm working with. And so what we're talking about is their occupancy levels right now being at that 50 ish to 75, 80-ish children. And so as those children are spread around into the different classrooms, they're only now getting to the point where they're getting to these group sizes that may require them to have to install dividers. But as of also the end of the summer coming into the school year, the state did allow the increase of that roughly that 50% group size break at 10 increased to about 75%. So they were allowed some increase, and as of today, where we're now seeing again increased cases across the country, I have not heard that the state of New Jersey has yet cut back that occupancy back to say this groups of no more of 10 levels. So, but I would anticipate that potentially that's going to happen. So what are some methods? So I just, as you can see on the slide, is basically being able to take a classroom and installing a divider that now creates separate space that you can now have separate groups. Those dividers are not required to be permanent in nature. They don't have to be a sheetrock wall. They can be plexiglass, and as simple as a shower curtain, like you might have seen out at retail establishments that they're using. So, you know, but they're definitely needing to be that separation. Now, on the interior space, where does that begin to impact the requirements of occupancy in the building code? Well, if you are installing more permanent solutions like walls, then you now have to look back at those requirements for egress, because with childcare, any classrooms that have more equal to or more than 10 children, you're required to have 2 means of egress. Now, if you put in a permanent barrier and you have that group of 10, if you do have 10, you're required to have 2 means of egress from that smaller space. And now you get into the issue of egressing in between even more classrooms, not directly out to a corridor. So, so as of right now, we haven't really gotten into that scenario of having to consider permanent barriers with the issues that will happen with the building code. Additionally, it's not only building code, but now you have to look at licensing regs, because the licensing will require potentially more lavatories to be installed because of now, if you do have a permanent barrier and you're creating that permanent separation. So that would have to be looked at. And of course, it's something that would want to be avoided. Playgrounds also, you have the potential of needing to separate. And of course, that could be done with fencing or other solutions. But again, as of right now, that hasn't happened. But the average playground sizes are, you know, well above 1,000 square feet and are in the 2,000 to 5,000 square foot sizes. So you can obviously break the playgrounds up into many different areas and be able to have different groups out at the same time. Most childcare centers are operating where there's really only a classroom or 2 classrooms at a time out on the playground. It is not like elementary school where there's recess, lunchtime, and everybody's out on the playground. So there was already a level of scheduling of children in playgrounds where it was in smaller groups. So that would just have to occur more as, again, the numbers increase. So I just wanted to give some examples of a couple of site plans just to offer, you know, what site design considerations, how they're impacted. So in this plan, what you'll see is, number one, as I mentioned earlier, that there may be now an exterior drop-off from a vehicle if they're not parking, which now would create a queuing issue in the parking lot that you typically don't have. And so with that queuing, again, it's a matter of, is there adequate queuing area within the existing parking lot? Second to that is as you now have that queuing during a drop-off or pickup time, you now potentially are having that queuing blocking parking spaces. What I can tell you is that under normal circumstances, there is normally not a queuing issue in a parking lot of a childcare. And because of the sequencing and the speed of the timing from a parent leaving the car, bringing the child into the school, getting back to the car, that's a turnaround of normally 5 to 8 minutes. And so you have enough parking spaces for that turnaround during a typical drop-off and pickup time. But again, now, the other thing is that in order for the child care staff to be able to handle it being all outside is whether or not they implemented a staggered time for drop-off, where parents now had a specific time that they were dropping off, and that reducing the load of that traffic. The other is considerations for having to have additional overhead protection. And as I mentioned earlier, with there being colder climate now, potentially additional enclosures, temporary enclosures, and heating them so that when parents are coming to the school and having the screening done, they're not standing outside in the freezing temperatures. The other, as we just saw on the previous slide, which was being able to divide the playground into multiple sections for additional groups. One other consideration with the additional, queuing of cars and potentially that scenario now involving maybe needing to add additional protection in the parking lot with the children being moved from the car into the school. We typically do include bollards within the parking lot. That is mostly to protect the building from cars impacting the building, which has happened because you do have head-in spaces. Now it would potentially involve protecting them, obviously, with the pedestrian movement between the car and the building. So it would extend out. This site plan configuration, kind of the same. You do have a circular motion. The other potential consideration is that now where in a typical parking area, you would have movement of the vehicles in both directions around that circular pattern, potentially implementing a one-way traffic, especially with the drop-off sequencing the queuing. Again, just a different configuration plan. So where again, you might have playground space on both sides, you have the ability to divide on both sides. Again, the condition of additional overhead protection. The interior of this particular building allows for a much larger interior vestibule waiting area, and you'll see that in the next slide. So I'll discuss where potentially the interior can be divided if parents are allowed on the interior, again, because of these colder climates we're going to come into. So, this slide showing building design consideration number 1, you can see this building layout is basically a square. You do have a donut configuration of hallway on the interior. And so working from the entry sequence of the facility, again, I was just discussing there potentially being in larger vestibules, maybe the ability to create a barrier that would allow the parents to come inside during the drop-off in the colder climate, and there still being a separation from them entering the school. Even though common vestibules, we do design them as a security point. Ron was talking about earlier a little bit about security, that we do design them as a secure interior door. Even though that keeps the parents separated from the rest of the school, the issue becomes more of still HVAC, and the fact that, of course, that air in the vestibule is the same air that's inside the school. So that's a consideration when potentially now visitors or parents being allowed to be in that vestibule, even though still separated. So again, here, what you'll see is the implementation, just an example of a divider in a classroom, highlighted in the color blue. The other consideration has to be for toilet rooms. In scenarios where there may be a shared toilet room between two classrooms, those two classrooms have to be treated entirely as separate groups. And so now if they're coming in to share a toilet, there has to be consideration for one side, one class being able to use that toilet at one time, and then the other class being able to come in while the other class isn't using it. So now you have, again, an additional scheduling issue there, but there has to be also the consideration for providing the dividers in the toilet rooms as it relates to separate groups. So in New Jersey, one thing I didn't mention, but it is mentioned in my my notes on the slide, is that the group of children per classroom has to be kept the same. As well, the teachers for those classrooms have to be kept the same, so that there's essentially no cross-contamination. And so now when you have that shared toilet between those classrooms, you obviously have shared contamination. And so that's where, again, it has to get taken into consideration for the dividers in potentially a toilet room. Corridors. So now in this configuration, we do have a donut. That donut configuration can be treated now as a one-way, whereas in a T configuration, or one that just isn't a donut, you can't have that. In future design consideration, there may need to be widening of corridors to provide more ability of social distancing when having classes move together in the same hallway or corridor. So that's got to be considered. The other consideration, similar to classroom, is a multi-purpose room, where the ability to provide a divider so you can have separate groups in that multi-purpose room at the same time, or in general, that they can't get used at the same time. When you have a multi-purpose room that is going to be used by the multiple different classrooms, there has to be cleaning done in between. So just like if you're going now yourselves to a gym, there has to be a cleaning process before you now allow for another group of people to come into the space. This other plan shows the example of not having a donut corridor, and so now you do have people crossing one another in corridors. So a potential for this configuration is, if you did do it as a one-way, you now have to have these classrooms move separately outside of the building and around to potentially, say, get to the multi-purpose, which really doesn't work from an operational standpoint. So realistically, what would happen is each classroom, the children would remain in the classroom. The director would schedule then a classroom moving the children from the class into the multi-purpose. So again, they're not being potentially cross-contamination within that corridor. Otherwise, the other examples here are the same as the prior, just example of room division, separate. Here you'll see in this plan, we do have a shared toilet between two classrooms. So again, the consideration of how do you divide that, or is it used separately? So enhanced cleaning methods, you'll see in these photos, what's going on. So childcare centers, as I mentioned earlier, already institute methods of cleaning every day as required by the licensing. So the increase of the frequency was not such a big change, but it's the fact of more labor and more overhead with the frequency. And so now you have teachers, additional teachers, having to be there to do that cleaning while nobody's in class. Because for those of you that have done childcare centers, daycare centers, you understand that part of the requirements is that you have a teacher-child ratio. And so if for whatever reason a teacher has to be removed from a certain number of students that really requires that teacher to be there, you need another teacher to step in to keep that teacher-child ratio within the guidelines. So of course, in order to keep the teachers also with their groups, you now have to have separate teachers or staff now able to go into that classroom or the multi-purpose room and clean it in between classrooms. So again, you have the increase of overhead. You'll see bullet point 3 talks about ensuring HVAC systems continue to be maintained and operational. What has to also be considered is that not all schools have operable windows. So you don't have the ability to open the window, allow fresh air in. You're relying 100% on your HVAC systems. I will tell you from doing this work now for more than 10 years, most of the centers are all actually built and owned by a developer. Developers don't want to spend anything extra on these facilities. It is always pulling teeth to be able to maintain the level of HVAC systems and what we include in that in terms of the size of the system because of the increase in fresh air in order to maintain low levels of humidity. Now, with us looking at it more from the standpoint of maintaining cleaner air, again, it was already pulling teeth. It's more understood now because of COVID and potential future pandemics. But some other methods that can be looked at to increase the air purification within the HVAC systems are things such as UV light, ionization, and even misting of hydrogen peroxide. So those are all things that have been looked at by us for our clients. Some of those are being implemented, and bottom line is it is something that should be done for the safety of the occupants of the building. So, so that's something that is really important to this. The big picture here on the design of the buildings is making sure that the HVAC systems are really, they're doing the work of keeping these classes and buildings as safe as possible. And one other simple thing is making sure that they're able to just keep the system running even overnight, which the operators don't want to do because, of course, that increases their utility costs. But again, that's something that simply will allow for the system to continue to circulate the air and purify it if other systems are implemented. Lastly,
Justin,
is this last slide for resources for anybody to look at thereafter. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Justin. Jason, you're up.
Hello, everybody. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yes.
Good.
We can hear you.
Let me share my screen. So I want to pick up on some points that Ron and Justin made. And, architects are historically responsible for protecting health, safety, and welfare of the public in what we do. COVID has really accented that need and added some new requirements that I think Ron and Justin touched on really well. And many of us are being asked for solutions from our clients because they're not sure what to do. And they're turning to architects, engineers, and other specialists to try and help them get back in their buildings and conduct their business and get on with their life. So you may be getting asked for solutions about furniture, whether it's existing or new, space flow, as Justin was talking about with corridors and how to use classrooms, the planning of space that Ron mentioned with, how do we design for learning environments in the future, and do they look the same as they have? Occupancy rates and what is allowed and what should be allowed based on guidance, and how does that play forward? protective barriers, and then, as Justin was just talking about, HVAC operations and design. So these are all in the toolkit and the general scope of architects and engineers as part of this response to COVID. The question that it leaves me is, does implementing those things provide certainty that you are going to mitigate the impact of COVID? And my general feeling is no. With many designs, as we know, they're only as good as how the building occupants and owners use them. And there are some things in particular related to this problem that are specific to the owner and the building occupants. And that includes cleaning, which Justin just mentioned. And my perspective here from a sustainability standpoint, and even with the other items on the previous slide, is how do we implement these measures in a way that is in fact healthy and sustainable, both environmentally responsible and healthy for the people in the buildings. We don't want to start slathering bleach and ammonia to clean with, because we know that those are potential toxic chemicals to many occupants and can trigger other issues like asthma. We don't want to introduce furniture and plastics in the building that off-gas chemicals, which may contribute to poor indoor air quality when we're trying to fight an airborne illness. So the cleaning protocols, the emergency planning, how the occupants use the building in particular now is even more critical. The availability and the actual use of the PPE. I don't know about you guys, but I've seen many people that have masks down over their mouth, but not over their nose and mouth, or that have the mask on their chin and not over their nose and mouth, or the mask up on their forehead. What's the point of the PPE if it's not being used properly? And then the building system operations and maintenance. As Justin just mentioned, the HVAC systems are critical, absolutely critical. And many buildings are older with older existing HVAC systems. And clients are asking, well, can I put in a higher level filter? The answer is probably not, but it's something that needs to be assessed by the manufacturer, by the engineer, to see if it's even possible. So there's a lot of things here that even if we provide the best design and guidance that we can as architects and engineers, these items are really in the hands of the owner, and they will ultimately impact how effective buildings are at dealing with COVID and other things in the future. COVID is the first major pandemic we've had in a century. The likelihood is, as population continues to rise and climate change continues to worsen, that these are going to be more frequently occurring. So I, as many of you on the call may know, am a big fan of measuring and verifying performance, and I think that gives a little bit more peace of mind. There are a couple documents and organizations out there that provide guidance. CDC certainly is first and foremost. The Road Back, which Ron had mentioned, the Restart and Recovery Plan for Education, was issued by the state of New Jersey. But the two that I'm going to focus most on are the LEED rating system, which has published a series of pilot credits called Safety First, and the Well Building Standard, which has published an actual rating called the Health and Safety Rating. Many of you are probably familiar with the LEED rating system more so than the Well Building Standard. In this particular instance, in this situation that we find ourselves in, the Well Building Standard is probably even more applicable. But the issue with the Restart and Recovery document, and Ron alluded to this from the state of New Jersey, is that it is a very large, dense set of guidelines. And you can see in the language that there are some anticipated minimum requirements and considerations. It's sort of a collection of best practices, and it's a plan, and it kind of stops at the plan. And because it's such a large collection of best practices, the feedback I've gotten from the folks in the K-12 world is they don't know what to do. They don't know which of these they should implement. They don't know what's most applicable to them in their school districts. And the follow-up for how well the plan is being implemented, the measurement and verification part, isn't really part of this effort and document. So it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of a consistent action across an individual school district with multiple schools, let alone all of the school districts across the state of New Jersey. The LEED Safety First pilot credits are a group of credits that were put together in response to COVID specifically. And you can see here the list of those credits, which I'm going to talk about. They include disinfecting and cleaning, re-entering your workspace, building water system recommissioning, managing indoor air quality, pandemic planning, social equity, and something called the ARC re-entry credit, which I will discuss. And I'm only going to be able to give you a brief overview of these. There are links at the end of this presentation to further go in and find more information about these if you're interested. What I think both the LEAD and the WELL documents provide is a concise checklist that you can go through. Ron had shown you a checklist that they put together, which looked rather extensive. And this is something that you can point your clients to and that you can use in your own design process to go through and sort of really integrate the best practices into what you're doing. So green cleaning and disinfecting, this is not really something that's in the realm of architectural design, but what we have are spaces that now need to be cleaned multiple times, as Justin alluded to. And what are we cleaning with? So this gives a policy and an implementation process, but it focuses on green cleaning, selecting non-toxic, least toxic products that still kill COVID, very effective, something as simple as hydrogen peroxide or other non-toxic cleaners versus something like bleach. Re-entering your workspace, this is to help assess and plan for re-entry. As both Ron and Justin brought up, there are a lot of issues about going back into existing buildings with existing plans and how those can be used in a situation like this, and do we continue to use them in that way going forward? So again, focusing on sustainable requirements, not just getting back in, but how are these going to be healthy for people and healthy for planet? And this touches on building operations, human behavior, and more importantly, with this particular credit, there is a transparent reporting and evaluation process that's needed. One of the issues I think that's arisen from this is, how are we reporting back to parents, to staff, to students, what's being done, why it's being done, and the success of what's being done to mitigate the risk at the end of the day. And these are where I see some of the values of things like LEAD and WELL for this effort. Building water systems. Some of these buildings have sat vacant for quite a while, anywhere from 3 to 6 months. What's the condition of the water quality now? This is something that needs to be seriously considered. Legionella could be a problem. And so this credit talks specifically about developing and implementing a water management plan to address and assess these concerns. Indoor air quality, ventilation. We know that we have always been asked to design buildings to bare minimum code. We know that we are typically in buildings providing bare minimum ventilation. Older buildings were designed to a different code than more modern buildings, so the ventilation could be worse or better depending on that. In some cases, you can increase filtration. In some cases, you can't. So all of these are part of this managing indoor air quality credit here. First and foremost is to confirm that the systems are operating as designed, and then determining any temporary adjustments that may need to be made as far as ventilation, filtration, distancing, monitoring, etc. But the other key here is monitoring and evaluating on an ongoing basis. Measurement and verification, right? Pandemic planning. This is a bit of a bigger picture. This is for preparing and controlling the mitigation of diseases like this. We haven't really thought about this much. We've designed to bare minimum codes and assumed that that was good enough. But if we are going to see more issues like this that we have to deal with, business as usual is not something we can go back to. So this helps people think about, what about the next pandemic? How are we going to deal with situations that may happen again? How can we prevent it? Education and training are part of this credit, which I think is really important for staff and parents. The social aspect, which Ron touched on. Not everybody has a computer and an internet connection. How do we get consistent distance learning? Who do we bring back in to learn in person? Childcare is a different issue because there's not as much education necessarily going on, but still the equity part of this is who has access to that childcare and how do they get to and from it? So all of this is part of the social equity aspect of this credit. ARC reentry, the ARC platform is something that LEAD introduced a couple of years ago, and ARC is the reporting mechanism for LEAD today. LEAD, as some of you may know, is a third-party certification system, and it's a certification typically of a moment in time of a building. You renovate or design a building, it opens, you get a LEED plaque, it's date stamped for that year, And no matter what happens after that, the building has that plaque with that date. The building could be performing terribly. It could be performing wonderfully, but it has that date stamp with that certification. That's what I call a static certification. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. The ARC platform is real-time, ongoing, monthly reporting of sustainability. And specifically, it includes health and wellness. So everything that I just talked about in these pilot credits can be reported, monitored, shared, and seen by staff, parents, and the community if a school district or a child care center chose to make this live on their website, for example. And you can see how you're doing with these various elements that are measured under ARC. So this is one of the more exciting things to me about what's happened with LEAD, but certainly in a world where we need ongoing reporting and transparency, I think it's really important. Which takes a different focus than LEAD has historically. LEAD focuses on the environment heavily and human health sort of secondarily. The pilot credits I just showed you focus on human health exclusively. But they're not a certification unto themselves. They're a group of credits that can be pursued as part of a larger LEAD certification. The nice thing about ARC is you can put your client's project into the ARC platform without the pressure of certifying and still track all the credits I just showed you without getting a certification. WELL has an actual rating for health and safety. They put this together in response to COVID specifically, and you can see it has very similar focuses as the LEAD pilot credits: cleaning and sanitation, emergency preparedness, health services, air and water quality, and stakeholder engagement. So I'm not going to go through all those individually in great detail, but you can see here, it really focuses on these main areas about policy adoption, about implementing good maintenance protocols, having emergency plans in place, and then stakeholder education and engagement, the idea of communicating what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the success of it again. And in response to something like COVID, the areas that they chose to focus on here, you've heard mentioned by Ron and by Justin. Again, how do you get your clients to get their head around this, plan for all these things, work with them to design all of the elements that are needed for these key areas, and then ultimately implement and measure it? I find that both LEAD and WELL offer a platform to do this logically, to ask the right questions from both sides, and to make sure that you can assign responsibilities, track progress, and ultimately share success at the end of the day. For the WELL system itself, there is an enrollment for this rating. You choose what you're going to do within each of those credit areas that I just showed you. That is third-party reviewed by GBCI, which is the same organization that reviews the LEAD rating system. Assuming that you achieve the requirements for the WELL credits, you'll earn your rating. And then that is something that is an ongoing process that you continue to get certified in. The difference between this and LEAD is that because this is an actual standalone rating, you can now display that you are a WELL health and safety certified space. And that may give people a lot of comfort of mind to see this plaque on the front door when they're coming back to work, when they're dropping off their kids. So this is a little bit of a differentiator from the LEAD pilot credits. There are some resources here that I want to give to folks. This the links to WELL, link to the USGBC site. This is the link to the nj.gov where the restart and reopening plan is. The American Institute of Architects, it was referenced, has its own assessment tool. And the LEAD pilot credits, as far as the design elements of those pilot credits, are based on the AIA reoccupancy assessment tool recommendations. So LEAD has already wrapped this in with AIA and what AIA has been doing to be proactive in response to COVID. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. If I could have each of our panelists turn on your microphone and camera, we'll go through our questions. We do have 6 questions already entered. If other people would like to ask a question, please do so. Christy DiBartolo would like to mention that unfortunately, the idea of outdoor classrooms was declined because there are too many safety concerns with abductions, active shooters, etc. To provide outdoor space that is also safe was too cost prohibitive of a retrofit, but it may work better for a new construction project. So that was a comment that Christy wanted to mention from her school district. Christy, thank you for sharing that. We have a question from Steve Elmetz. In the case of daycare egress and sanitary requirements, do you think that local building departments will grant temporary relief given that this is a temporary situation with COVID-19? Justin or Jason, do you have any thoughts on that? Or any of you?
I can tell you that thus far, we haven't seen anything.
Thank you. From Nolan Thorpe, the shared toilets will require an electronic interlock as well. That's a comment on the shared bathrooms. Okay.
Is that a question or is that a
It's
statement?
a comment. It's a statement.
I think in some cases that's true. I think in a lot of times with younger kids, that those toilet, they're monitored. In other words, there's a teacher, faculty, or staff person watching. So you don't necessarily need to have an electronic solution, but I acknowledge that is an approach to it.
Right, I would agree, Ron. In daycare, childcare, there's monitoring by teachers. So I don't believe that we haven't found that that's something that'll be required by licensing.
Noreen Rockford is mentioning finishes and furniture that need to be cleaned and re-cleaned will be different from finishes that we've picked in the past. Do you have any comments on materials that we're going to stop using or that we need to focus on using that make it easier to keep surfaces clean or clean repeatedly?
Jason, if you want to take that, I'll just say in general, yes, there are emerging in the healthcare world, healthcare sector. They've been on the leading edge in terms of antiviral, antimicrobial materials. There's a bunch of them coming out. Time will tell, and I think in new schools we certainly will be doing more of that using those kinds of materials.
Yeah, I would add to that fabrics are always going to be an issue with something like that. So the harder surface furniture is going to be easier to clean. Using a sustainable alternative to something like a vinyl covering, like a Zoril, which is cleanable like vinyl but is made from sugarcane, is a good option. But yeah, that goes to the point of we can't start putting toxic products in buildings and using toxic chemicals to clean to try and fix one problem, because it may very well create bigger problems elsewhere with indoor air quality and health issues.
Thank you, Jason. Question from an anonymous attendee. Why is minimum code for HVAC bad? And what is LEED recommending above and beyond minimum code?
I wouldn't say necessarily that minimum code is bad. It is just bare minimum. And so, it's a delicate balance of energy consumption and what is the amount of fresh air that we should be introducing into buildings. The more fresh air we bring in, the more energy we use to heat and cool that air. So those two things are often at odds. LEED has always had a bare minimum requirement to meet the ventilation code, and there's been an option to upgrade to higher levels of filtration and bring in more air for credits. So a MERV 13 filter is recommended instead of MERV 8 filters in mechanical systems, and increasing fresh air by at least 30% is the recommendation in LEED and both WELL to provide a better indoor air quality. When I design projects, I am really pushing the envelope to try and get as close as I can to 100% outdoor fresh air supply. But that has to be done carefully with heat recovery and humidity control so that you're not getting killed on energy if you want to increase ventilation.
I'll answer it from a different perspective. That the issue we have here in New Jersey is that building departments do not review mechanical drawings for the actual mechanical design. They only review them mainly to ensure that there are duct smoke detectors where required based on the size of the system. And second to that, there's no inspections in the field as to the mechanical system. So, and this isn't only New Jersey, this is other states as well. I do find that in other states, the review of the mechanical plans is much better than what occurs here. So developers know this. And again, I was talking earlier about the difficulty that we have in being able to maintain those systems, because the developers ultimately are building the centers, the majority of them. And so really we get back into this situation that the code is actually, even though it's minimum, it's not bad. It's not that it's the code. It's that there's no inspection and approval process once it's designed. And that's what needs to get put into place, because then it won't be the developer, in my example, saying, hey, listen, I don't want to pay for that. What's the code minimum? I'll do the code minimum. Then it will be a matter of, you're just not going to get it. It's not going to pass. It's not going to approve. And so, so that to me is what I see is the bigger issue that we have.
Well, and one quick follow-up on that. ASHRAE, which is the ventilation code that we follow, does have requirements for commissioning to make sure that these systems are installed, tested, and working as designed. The state of New Jersey specifically has always waived the enforcement of that section of ASHRAE. If you go to New York City, New York State, they enforce that requirement for commissioning of mechanical systems as part of inspections that have to take place. So as you mentioned, Justin, it varies state to state. New Jersey has always taken a rather lax attitude when it comes to MEP verification.
Question from Salvatore Corino. Are there possibilities for the development of product coatings for use in schools or any building that would kill the virus, similar to some of the products out there, such as anti-mold paints and coatings, materials now offered on the market? I read something about a scientist who had developed a sodium-based coating on a mask that killed or inhibited the COVID virus. Is there any product manufacturer considering development for that type of coating for material surfaces?
I don't know the answer to that question, but we're in a new situation and a new territory. I think you're going to see a lot of new products come on the market. And as architects, we have to play the part of the skeptic to make sure that these things are actually safe, that they actually do what they say. You're going to hear a lot of manufacturers' claims, which is something that we hear all the time as architects in looking at products. Hopefully some of these products will get developed and will be out there. I haven't seen any yet like that. But I would continue to be cautious and skeptical of those things as they come out. Not to say that they can't be used, but you know, the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Anonymous attendee, do you think adding UV light to HVAC systems are worth the cost in terms of COVID?
From my perspective, yes.
And I'll just add on, for public schools where budgets are, you know, again, the daycare centers are privately operated. Well, I shouldn't say they all aren't, but many times. But for public schools that are stressed out and have old buildings and are adapting, the question will be, can they afford that? You'll see that more in the private sector, the health sector, commercial office, and even the daycare centers, which tend to be, as Justin said, private developers. But I don't know that exactly at the end of the day if where that's going to land. It certainly, those seem to be effective. They cost money though, a lot of money up front, capital cost.
And Ron, just to add to that, you are correct. There's obviously different levels of quality and sizes. Typically, they do have to be fitted to the size of the system. But when you do compare the UV next to some other alternates that I discussed, the UV is actually a better cost, more cost effective than some of those others. So I think that in general, UV is not the only option. And so that you can look at UV, you can look at ionization and some other things, and again, evaluate that based on the system and then go from there.
Kenneth Stoyak is asking, do you foresee future IBC modifications and reduced capacities based on this pandemic?
I think the codes typically in the wake of any kind of big event will certainly evaluate it. I imagine there could be some changes. when you say reduced capacity, I don't think the long-term, the occupancies of schools are going to go down post-pandemic. I think it's really more adapting for future shocks to the system and managing those.
Yeah, and to follow up on that,
Yeah.
I mean, maximum code occupancy of a classroom is typically different than how the classroom is actually used once you add in the furniture, the teacher to student ratio. I think you might see maximum code occupancy drop, but to your point, Ron, I don't think you're going to see how the classrooms are utilized necessarily drop long term.
In the childcare daycare arena, it's already heavily controlled occupancy, as Jason just mentioned, by way of, and I mentioned earlier, teacher-child ratios, maximum group sizes. So I don't foresee seeing any changes in that arena.
Terry Owens asked, worst case scenario for safety design. Any idea on cost per square foot?
No, I can't say a specific thing. Maybe Jason, you might have better ideas. It depends what you're gonna, what kind of permanent capital improvements you're making, as opposed to the quick fixes for short term.
Yeah, that really is a building by building case. That and like sustainability, there's no silver bullet because it's not a one size fits all.
I can. I've already conducted some schematic design and budgeting. For example, just a typical entry vestibule, and the cost for bulletproofing walls, providing bulletproof glazing, doors, hardware is in the magnitude of about $25,000 to $35,000. And again, that can climb based on the level of ballistic protection that you want to provide. So that's really like at the lowest level, which would basically be like a 9mm handgun, and or again, a shotgun. But anything as like an automatic weapon higher than a 9mm, you're getting into thicker materials, that are used to line the walls, and then the same thing goes with the glazing.
Thank you, Justin. From Paul Tajlov, is it true that HVAC systems can sometimes not be upgraded with better filters due to wear on the units that they haven't been designed for?
Absolutely true. You can't take a MERV 13 filter and put it in a system that's designed for MERV 8. Basically, the way these filters work is the higher the filter number, the denser the filter and the smaller the particle it takes out. So that means that your fan has to work harder to push air through that MERV 13 filter. You run the risk of burning out motors, chillers, etc., by putting in a denser filter into a system that was not designed for it. This is where you need to get the manufacturer or the installer or your engineer or commissioning agent involved to look at the existing system, what it can handle, and what you can do. In many cases, retrofitting these existing systems with something like that is not an option, and that's where the UV filter or the ionization can come into play as the only viable options in those scenarios.
Thank you. Question from an anonymous attendee. What information have you found on COVID infection rate for population going to school versus the community at large? Are there actually lower infection rates in schools, which sounds counterintuitive?
Well, actually, there's been a lot of press and a lot of controversy about this. I can't answer definitively that, and there's still probably, frankly, getting the actual data to confirm that. And different people across the spectrum have different opinions about that. And so anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if anyone, my colleagues have anything to add.
I think the jury's out on that one.
I will say that, this is not statistically based, but my school system has been open since, immediately after Labor Day. And all of the COVID circumstances that we've encountered, by students or faculty originated outside of the school system and were contained. So we right now, the first week of December are in our first week that the school has been closed related to COVID. So all these months, the school population within the building has been able to sustain a safe interaction. But again, that's just been our local experience, so not statistically based. William Modem, please share your thoughts regarding the thinking that the design considerations and challenges that were presented are temporary for our current pandemic versus real advocacy for the future of design and necessary emerging model code changes.
Yeah, I think, look, one thing is we don't want to necessarily rush in to basically take the short-term, it's still relatively short-term, even though we've been engaged in this over 8 months. We don't want to too quickly jump to conclusions, but I totally feel that we must evaluate this thoughtfully and look at advocating for the future, and not, frankly, lose the opportunity that comes along with the challenges and tragedy in many cases of this pandemic. So I do think architects in particular, designers, we should be at the table as advocates long-term, thoughtfully, proposing ideas for the future.
And I'll follow up with that and say, my general view of building codes, which are supposed to be there to protect health, safety, and welfare, are that they are bare minimum and that they're typically developed in response to disasters. And this is a disaster. This is a human health crisis. So I think that you are going to see things get modified in response to this, unfortunately, as a reactive element. But should we have better ventilation in buildings? Yes. Should we have non-toxic products and cleaning in the buildings? Yes. As far as the physical design, width of corridors, flow of space, barriers and partitions, I don't think those things are gonna necessarily outlive this particular situation. But there are some practices, protocols, policies, and code-related items like ventilation and other things that should change as a result of this permanently, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with Jason. There's no doubt that HVAC systems across the board need to be improved. And if we did actually follow, going back to the earlier question about code minimum, if we did actually follow ASHRAE, they would be healthier environments. So that to me is a no-brainer, and that's what we're obviously pushing in the childcare space that we're within. But the others, back to Ron's comment, yeah, I think you have to use your best judgment. As we know, there's always a knee-jerk reaction, but then there's really the long-term planning and maybe how can a building's plan be adjusted where you then don't need those. So does that mean smaller classroom sizes and other things, more toilet rooms separated, not having gang toilets? So there are those other considerations to look at much more in a longer term.
Sunobi Gulanami asks us, in light of COVID, are more of your clients expressing a desire to seriously pursue WELL certification?
I can tell you from my end, yes. We are busier than we have ever been when it comes to health and wellness, and particularly the WELL building standard. We have about a half a dozen projects right now that would probably have stopped if it were not for the fact that they pivoted to getting a WELL certification on their projects. That standard is specifically geared at human health and wellness as a spin-off of the LEED rating system. And it's never been more applicable than today.
And what looks like our last question, one of you mentioned issues with off-gassing of furniture. What about the plexiglass screens and shower curtains that are being used everywhere? Aren't there compliance issues with flame spread and smoke developed ratings of these materials as well?
The short answer is yes. Fabric or flexible screens can often off-gas chemicals known as phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors and highly toxic to some people. Plexiglass or hard surface materials don't off-gas the same way as those soft fabric materials do, but they are potential issues in fires. They may pass the flame spread rating, but when you burn plastic, it gives off dioxin, which is the most toxic chemical known to man. So if you're putting those kinds of things in buildings, yes, they may pass the code for flame spread, but in the event that there is a fire, they do become, you may die from the smoke more than the fire sort of situation. So, that was my point in my talk, is we can't start making moves to fix one problem that can create bigger health problems down the road inadvertently. We really have to take a holistic look at these things. And this is why I think that the very clear guidance in systems like LEED and WELL should be part of any conversation for products and materials.
Yeah, I'll say another thing, observation is obviously in the reentry stage, we've seen a lot of these, even some teachers or custodial staffs making these plastic sneeze guard protectors and desks and things. A lot of that, and it's understandable, it's that initial reaction to protect people initially, and it provides some benefit, but longer term, as Jason's saying, it really needs to be thought out, because some of that, unfortunately, I think some of that is not even really helping when it's amateur, made at home plastic guards with this airborne coronavirus. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Renee Gustino asks, is anyone in the code community thinking about designing schools to be as flexible as possible, such as using for emergency shelters or healthcare facilities?
Yeah, actually, that's the interesting point. There have been trends, mainly in larger urban districts. Many schools, big high schools and some middle schools, have health clinics in them, literally like a health clinic. I'll use that as an example. And then, honestly, even emergency shelters, schools as well. There are schools that are designated as emergency shelters, and there are actually LEED credits you get for shared community use of schools. So that's been around for a while, and it's a growing trend. I would expect you could see even more of it in the future, independent even of the pandemic.
Thank you, Ron. That concludes our questions. I want to thank everyone for staying with us today, and all of our presenters for not only giving their insight during their presentation, but for such comprehensive response to our audience's questions. I encourage everyone on the call to please register for the December 17th program on contract interiors, and to look out for additional programs in 2021. And also to let you know that the recording of today's webinar will be available on the AIA New Jersey YouTube channel, and the announcement of when that is released will come through our newsletter and on social media. So thank you all. I appreciate you participating. We're getting a lot of comments from our participants that they got a lot out of this presentation, so we're glad we were able to offer it to you. Everyone, please have a safe holiday, and stay strong. Try as best you can to reduce your COVID fatigue as we get through these last months and access to the vaccine. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.